Security, escort her out. Now. The command landed sharp and final, slicing through the quiet marble lobby of Sterling Trust Bank at exactly 10:12 a.m. And every head turned as Naomi Carter remained seated, calm, composed, her fingers resting lightly on the polished table as if the words weren't directed at her at all, as if she had heard them before in another room, another year, another version of this same moment. And yet something about the stillness in her posture felt deliberate, like she wasn't being removed. She was waiting for something to arrive. The guard hesitated for half a second before stepping closer, his shoes echoing against the floor, uncertain but obedient, because authority had already been established by the man standing behind him. Daniel Brooks, branch manager, mid-40s, tailored suit, the kind of voice that carried confidence built on assumption rather than truth, his eyes fixed on Naomi with that familiar calculation. Not curiosity, not professionalism, just judgment dressed as protocol. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he repeated, louder this time, making sure the surrounding clients could hear, making sure the room understood who belonged and who didn't. A subtle performance of control, and still Naomi didn't move, didn't argue, didn't even blink. She simply lifted her eyes, steady and quiet, meeting his gaze in a way that didn't challenge him but didn't accept him either. And that was what unsettled him most, because people who didn't belong were supposed to react, supposed to explain, supposed to shrink. But she did none of that, and the silence began to stretch, thick and uncomfortable, whispers forming in the corners of the room. A woman near the glass partition leaned toward her companion and murmured, "This doesn't feel right," while a young man near the teller line subtly raised his phone, not recording yet, just watching, sensing that something unseen was unfolding beneath the surface. Daniel shifted his stance, impatience creeping in. "We verified there is no active account under your name," he said, each word clipped, rehearsed. "And this area is reserved for verified clients." He paused, just long enough to let the implication settle, then added, "So I need you to stand up now." But Naomi remained exactly where she was, her presence no longer passive but anchored, like she had chosen that exact spot and intended to stay. And when the guard finally reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her shoulder, she spoke for the first time, her voice low, even, but it cut cleaner than anything Daniel had said. "Don't touch me again." The guard froze, not because of the volume, but because of the certainty, the kind that doesn't come from emotion but from knowing something others don't. And for the first time, the room shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the balance of control to tilt ever so slightly. Naomi glanced at the wall clock, a small movement, almost insignificant, yet precise, then back at Daniel, her expression unchanged. "You might want to give it 2 minutes, she said, and the words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like timing, like a sequence already in motion, and Daniel let out a short laugh, dismissive, a reflex to regain ground he didn't realize he was already losing. "This isn't a negotiation," he replied, but even he could feel it now, that quiet ripple moving through the room, the sense that something was about to break, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the kind of precision that doesn't ask for permission. And just beyond the glass doors at the front of the bank, unseen by most, a reflection shifted as 3 figures approached in perfect sync, their pace unhurried, their presence unmistakable. And inside, Naomi Carter didn't move, because she didn't need to. The moment was already on its way. Daniel Brooks forced a smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind of expression meant to reassure the room, but really meant to reassert control, and he stepped forward just enough to close the distance, as if proximity alone would make his authority feel heavier. 2 minutes for what?" he asked, his tone edged with irritation, but Naomi Carter did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him the same way she had been looking since the moment she walked in, calm, observant, almost patient. And that patience began to feel like pressure, the kind that builds quietly until it shifts everything at once. Around them the atmosphere tightened. Conversations that had once been casual were now hushed, attention no longer scattered but focused. A woman near the back adjusted her posture and whispered again, "She is not nervous." And that detail lingered because it was true. Naomi showed no urgency, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend herself. She sat as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere else, somewhere beyond this room. The guard slowly lowered his hand, not instructed to, just unsure now, caught between a manager giving orders and a presence that did not react the way it was supposed to. Daniel noticed it, and his jaw tightened. "This is not optional," he said, louder again, projecting certainty for the benefit of the witnesses. "You are not authorized to be here." But even as he spoke, something subtle shifted at the front of the bank, the glass doors opening with a soft mechanical sound that barely registered at first. Just another entry, just another moment in a busy morning. Except the people who walked in did not hesitate, did not look around, did not approach the reception desk like typical clients. They moved with direction, with intention. 3 individuals in dark suits, their pace measured, their eyes scanning not the room, but for someone specific, and it did not take long for them to find her. Naomi did not turn immediately. She did not need to. She could feel it, the timing aligning exactly as expected. Daniel was still speaking, still trying to hold the narrative together. "If you do not comply, we will escalate this further," he said. But his voice now carried a faint trace of something else. Not doubt yet, but the beginning of it. Because people were no longer looking at him the same way, their attention had shifted past him, toward the entrance, toward the presence that had just crossed into the space. The young man near the teller line lowered his phone slightly, his focus pulled toward the unfolding movement, and one of the suited figures spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly enough to cut through the room without effort. "We are looking for Ms. Naomi Carter." And that was the moment everything paused, not physically, but perceptibly, like the air itself had stopped moving. Daniel blinked, just once, a small delay, but enough to reveal that something had slipped outside of his control. Naomi finally stood, slow and composed, smoothing the front of her jacket as if this had always been the next step, her voice steady as she responded, "I am right here." And the 3 individuals approached her without hesitation, not questioning, not verifying, simply confirming what they already knew. And when they reached her, the one in front gave a slight nod, professional, precise. "Ma'am, we are ready whenever you are." And in that instant, the balance of power did not explode. It inverted, quietly, completely, and Daniel Brooks, who moments ago had been issuing commands, found himself standing in a room that no longer belonged to his voice. Daniel Brooks opened his mouth as if to reclaim the moment, but no words came out at first, just a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he forced his posture back into something resembling control. "I am sorry, who exactly are you?" he asked, directing the question not at Naomi Carter, but at the 3 individuals now standing beside her, as if ignoring her could somehow restore the hierarchy he had just lost. But the lead attorney did not shift his attention away from Naomi, did not acknowledge Daniel immediately, because his role was not to argue. It was to confirm, to execute. And that quiet refusal to engage made the tension in the room stretch even tighter. Naomi adjusted her sleeve with a small, deliberate movement, then finally turned her full attention back to Daniel, her expression unchanged, calm but no longer passive. "You asked for verification," she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the lobby. "So I brought it." And with that, the lead attorney stepped forward, his tone precise, measured, the kind that did not require volume to command attention. "Daniel Brooks, branch manager, correct," he said, already knowing the answer, already holding the file in his hand, and Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the room to notice, before responding, "Yes," his voice lower now, less certain. The attorney gave a single nod, then continued, "My name is Andrew Collins, senior legal counsel representing Carter Holdings Group." He paused briefly, allowing the name to settle, to connect, to land where it needed to, because names like that did not float without weight. They anchored, they shifted things, and around the room, subtle reactions began to ripple, a whisper here, a glance there, recognition forming not from familiarity, but from significance. Naomi stood beside him, silent again, letting the structure speak for her, letting the system do exactly what it was designed to do. Andrew opened the folder and continued. "We are here in response to a formal escalation initiated at 10:14 a.m. regarding a client dispute involving access denial, public mischaracterization, and procedural misconduct." Each phrase landed with clarity, not accusation, not emotion, just fact. And facts in that setting carried more weight than anything Daniel had said earlier. Daniel shifted his stance again, trying to find footing. There must be some misunderstanding, he said quickly, attempting to reframe the situation before it solidified. But Andrew did not pause, did not adjust. He simply turned one page and continued. There is no misunderstanding, he said, because the individual you attempted to remove from this property is not only a verified client, but also the majority stakeholder in the parent entity that oversees this institution. The words did not explode. They settled, heavy and undeniable, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Because the narrative had just been rewritten in a single sentence, Naomi finally stepped forward half a pace, not to dominate, not to intimidate, but to align herself with the truth that had just been spoken, her eyes meeting Daniel's again, steady, unwavering. You did not recognize me, she said quietly. That part is not the problem. Her gaze sharpened just slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. The problem is how quickly you decided I did not belong. And that sentence did what no raised voice could have done. It stripped the situation down to its core, leaving no room for policy, no space for excuses, just the reality of what had happened in that room. And as the weight of it settled over everyone present, Daniel Brooks stood there, no longer the authority he had been just minutes ago, but a man realizing, in real time, that the system he thought he controlled had just turned and was now looking directly at him. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the room itself was recalibrating around a truth no one had prepared for. And Daniel Brooks felt it first, not in what was said, but in what was no longer his to control. His authority had not been challenged loudly. It had been replaced quietly, and that difference unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. I was following standard procedure, he said, the words coming faster now, sharper, as if speed alone could rebuild credibility. But even as he spoke, it was clear the room was no longer listening the same way, because procedure had already been exposed as something else, something selective, something applied with bias rather than consistency. Andrew Collins did not interrupt him, did not correct him mid-sentence. He simply waited, allowing Daniel to finish, allowing every word to settle into the record that was now being formed in real time. And when Daniel stopped, Andrew responded with the same measured precision. Standard procedure requires verification, not assumption, he said, his tone neutral, but the distinction landed clearly. And it certainly does not authorize public removal without confirmed cause. He turned one more page in the file, the sound soft but final. We have already secured internal logs, timestamps, and witness accounts from this location within the last 10 minutes. And that was when the shift became irreversible. Because this was no longer a moment. It was documentation. It was record. It was something that would not disappear once the room emptied. Naomi Carter stood slightly to the side now. Not at the center, not needing to be, because everything that needed to be said was already unfolding through structure, through process, through a system that did not raise its voice, but did not forget either. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching for support, just observing. And she saw it. The way people were looking now, not at her clothing, not at her presence, but at the situation itself, at the realization that what they had witnessed was not a misunderstanding but a pattern, and that realization carried weight. A woman near the glass partition spoke a little louder this time, not whispering anymore. She told you to wait. And someone else added quietly. He did not listen. Small voices. But they mattered, because they confirmed what the room had already begun to understand. Daniel's posture shifted again. Less rigid now, more uncertain. We can resolve this internally, he said, attempting to pull the situation back into something contained, something manageable. But Andrew shook his head once, not dismissive, just definitive. This is already internal, he replied, and it is already under review. He stepped slightly to the side, creating space for Naomi without announcing it. And that was when she moved forward again, not hurried, not dramatic, just present, fully and undeniably present, her voice calm, but now carrying something more, not just composure, but ownership. You had multiple chances to pause, she said, looking directly at Daniel. To ask one more question, to verify one more detail, to choose restraint instead of assumption. Each phrase landed with clarity, not accusation, just fact. But you did not. She let that sit for a moment, not to emphasize it, but because it did not need emphasis. It was already understood. And that is why this is no longer a conversation about access, she continued. It is a conversation about conduct, and in that moment, the room shifted again, not in noise, not in movement, but in alignment, because the story that had started as a removal had now become an examination, and Daniel Brooks was no longer the one asking questions. He was the one being measured by them. For a brief moment no one spoke because there was nothing left to interrupt. The truth had already taken its place in the room, and it did not require repetition. It simply stood there, steady and undeniable. And Naomi Carter felt that shift the way she had felt it before, not just here, not just today, but years ago in smaller rooms with less polished floors and quieter exits. Moments where the outcome had been different because the power had not yet caught up to her presence. She remembered, standing at a loan officer's desk at 27, dressed sharper than she needed to be, documents organized down to the last page, only to be told her profile did not meet the standard, not because of numbers, but because of something unspoken that lingered behind the decision, something that sounded like policy but felt like dismissal. And she remembered walking out then, not arguing, not demanding, just carrying that moment forward and turning it into something larger, something that would one day bring her back into rooms like this with a different kind of weight. And now here she was again, same pattern, different scale, except this time the system had her name written into it, and that difference changed everything. She blinked once, returning fully to the present as Andrew Collins closed the folder with a soft but final motion. "We will be initiating a formal review of this branch effective immediately," he said, his voice even, professional, the kind that did not escalate, but did not retreat. "All staff interactions within the last 30 minutes are being documented and submitted to corporate compliance." The words landed like structure being rebuilt in real time, not chaotic, not emotional, just precise, and Daniel Brooks felt it, the ground beneath his authority shifting into something procedural, something that did not respond to tone or posture. "This is unnecessary," he said, but the confidence was thinner now, stretched. "We can correct the situation right now." But no one moved to support that idea, not the guard who had stepped back completely, not the employees behind the counters who now avoided eye contact, not even the customers who had quietly repositioned themselves to watch rather than participate, because correction implied control, and control had already left the room. Naomi took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment, to acknowledge the line that had been crossed and the line that had now been drawn in response. "You had the chance to correct it earlier," she said, her voice calm but carrying. When it was still about one decision, she paused just enough for the distinction to register. "Now it is about the pattern behind it." And that word settled deeper than anything else, pattern, because it suggested this was not isolated, not accidental, but part of something repeated, something learned, something reinforced over time, and that was harder to defend than a single mistake. Andrew nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in confirmation of process. "We will also be reviewing prior incident reports associated with this location," he added, "including any complaints that were previously marked as unverified." And that was when the weight shifted again, because the past had just been invited into the present, not as memory, but as evidence. Daniel's expression tightened, a flicker of realization crossing his face as he understood that this was no longer contained to this moment. It was expanding, connecting, building, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he did not have an immediate response, because there was nothing left to argue against, only something to face. Naomi glanced briefly toward the glass doors, sunlight cutting through the lobby in clean lines, then back at the room that had tried to remove her, her voice quieter now, but somehow more final. "This was never about access," she said. "It was about who you believed deserved it." And that sentence did not rise. It settled, firm and complete, leaving behind a silence that no one rushed to fill, because now everyone understood, the story had not just changed, it had revealed itself. No one moved to leave because leaving would have meant pretending nothing had happened, and that was no longer possible. The room had crossed a threshold where silence did not erase the moment, it preserved it, and Naomi Carter stood in the center of that stillness, not as someone reclaiming space, but as someone redefining it. Andrew Collins stepped slightly forward again, his presence steady, controlled. "We will require immediate access to this branch's internal review logs," he said, addressing no one in particular and everyone at the same time, as well as all employee conduct reports filed within the last 12 months. His tone remained neutral, but the request itself carried weight. Not optional, not negotiable, just the next step in a process already in motion. One of the bank employees behind the counter shifted nervously, glancing toward Daniel Brooks for direction. But Daniel did not respond right away, because direction was no longer his to give. He stood there, caught between what he had been minutes ago and what he was becoming now, a subject of review rather than the one enforcing it. "We need to handle this carefully," he finally said, his voice lower, more measured, attempting to regain a sense of control through caution, but the words felt delayed, like they belonged to a moment that had already passed. Naomi watched him for a brief second, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that comes when a situation reveals exactly what it is. She had seen this transition before, the shift from certainty to caution, from authority to accountability, and she did not interrupt it. She allowed it to unfold, because it mattered that it happened in front of witnesses, not hidden behind closed doors. Andrew nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. "Careful is exactly what this process is designed to be," he replied, "which is why it will proceed as documented." He turned slightly toward one of his colleagues, who was already preparing a tablet, pulling up files, timestamps, cross-references, everything aligned, everything structured, and that quiet efficiency contrasted sharply with the earlier chaos of assumptions. Naomi took a small step forward, not dramatic, not forceful, just enough to bring herself fully into the line of sight again, her voice calm but deliberate. "I did not come here to make a scene," she said, and the words settled differently now, because everyone knew she had not needed to. "I came here to complete a transaction," she continued, and what followed was not a misunderstanding, it was a decision. She paused briefly, letting that distinction settle once more. A decision made without information, without verification, and without restraint. The guard near the entrance shifted his weight again, his posture no longer rigid, no longer certain, because even he could feel it now, the difference between following orders and witnessing consequences. A woman who had been standing near the side desk spoke up again, her voice clearer this time. She never raised her voice, and that observation moved through the room quietly, reinforcing what everyone had already seen. Naomi had not argued, had not escalated, had not demanded. She had simply remained, and that stillness had revealed more than any confrontation could have. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally visible. "What happens now?" he asked, not to challenge, but because he genuinely did not know, and Andrew answered without hesitation. "Now the process continues," he said. "This branch will remain operational, but under immediate compliance observation." He glanced briefly at Naomi, a silent acknowledgement before continuing. "And all decisions made within this location from this point forward will be subject to review." The statement was not loud, not dramatic, but it changed everything, because it meant the system had not just responded, it had recalibrated. And as that realization settled over the room, Naomi Carter stood there for one more moment, not to prove anything further, but because she understood something they were only beginning to see. That power did not need to announce itself when it was already built into the structure, and what they had just witnessed was not her gaining control, it was her revealing that she had never lost it in the first place. The room did not return to normal because normal no longer existed in that space. Every movement now carried awareness, every glance carried context, and Naomi Carter could feel it in the way people adjusted their posture, in the way conversations no longer started but lingered unfinished. The bank was still open, transactions were still being processed, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. It felt observed, measured, as if the walls themselves had started listening. Andrew Collins remained composed, reviewing documents on the tablet now held by his colleague, quietly confirming timestamps and internal flags, while another member of the legal team stepped aside to make a brief call, low voice, precise language, the kind of communication that did not ask for urgency, because it already had priority. Daniel Brooks stood near the center of it all, but no longer at the center of control. His presence now part of the situation rather than above it. And that shift showed in the way he hesitated before speaking again. "We have always maintained a high standard of service here," he said, his tone attempting to recover structure, but it sounded more like a statement meant for record than for belief. Naomi turned slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the words without validating them. Her expression steady, thoughtful, as if she was weighing not just what he said but what he chose not to say. "Standards are not defined by policy alone," she replied, her voice even. "They are revealed in moments like this." And that line settled differently, because it did not accuse, it clarified. It reframed everything that had happened not as an exception but as a reflection. A young employee near the reception desk lowered her gaze, her hands still resting on the counter, but her posture now uncertain, as if she was replaying the earlier moments in her mind, seeing them differently with the information now in front of her. The guard remained by the entrance, no longer positioned as enforcement, but as presence, his stance relaxed, his role undefined for the first time since the situation began. And that detail did not go unnoticed. Naomi observed it briefly, not critically, just noting how quickly roles could shift when context changed. Andrew stepped back toward her after finishing his review, his voice low enough to remain professional but clear enough to carry. "Preliminary findings confirm procedural deviation within the first 3 minutes of interaction," he said, "including escalation without verification and public misclassification." Each phrase precise, structured, leaving no room for interpretation. Daniel nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the process had moved beyond his influence. "What does that mean for the staff?" he asked, the question no longer defensive, but uncertain, and Andrew answered, without hesitation, "It means accountability will be determined based on documented conduct, not assumption." And that word echoed again. Assumption. The same foundation that had started this entire situation, now being used to dismantle it. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze moving once more across the room, not searching, not judging, just observing the aftermath of a moment that had revealed more than anyone intended. "This is not about punishment," she said quietly, and the tone shifted. Again, softer, but no less firm. "It is about correction." She paused, allowing the distinction to settle. Because what is left uncorrected becomes repeated, and that was the final shift in that moment, not one of power, but of understanding, because now the room was no longer reacting to what had happened, it was recognizing what it meant. And Naomi Carter stood there not as someone who had just won a confrontation, but as someone who had exposed a system and chosen to address it, not with volume, not with force, but with clarity that could not be ignored. For a moment the room seemed to fade around her, not physically but emotionally, as if the present had loosened its grip just enough for something older to surface, something quieter but heavier. Naomi Carter stood still, yet her mind moved, not forward, not to what would happen next, but backward to a memory she had carried for years without ever needing to speak about it. She was 24 then, standing in a smaller bank across town, the kind with beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead, holding a folder that contained everything she had built up to that point. Her first real estate investment, her projections, her numbers, clean and precise. She remembered how carefully she had prepared, how she had rehearsed every answer on the drive there, how she had believed that preparation would be enough. But when the loan officer looked at her, it was not the documents he questioned, it was her. His eyes had paused just a second too long, his tone had shifted, just slightly. And then came the words she would never forget. "We are just not sure this is the right fit for you." And back then she had nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood something even at that age, that arguing would not change what had already been decided. She had walked out of that bank with her folder still in her hands, the numbers still valid, the plan still sound, but the door closed anyway, and that moment had followed her, not as anger, but as clarity. Clarity about how quickly decisions could be made without information, how easily someone could be reduced to an assumption, and how often systems allowed it to happen quietly, without consequence. The memory did not rush, it unfolded slowly, like a quiet echo layered beneath the present, and then it faded just as gently as it had arrived, because this moment was not the same, not anymore. Naomi returned fully to the room, to the polished floors, to the people who were now watching not out of curiosity, but understanding. Andrew Collins was speaking again, coordinating next steps with his team, but his voice now felt like background structure. The real shift had already happened. Naomi's gaze moved across the employees behind the counter, not searching for blame, but recognizing something else, recognition itself. She could see it in their faces, the subtle realization that this moment was not isolated, that it connected to something larger, something they had either witnessed before or participated in without fully seeing it. And that realization carried weight, because once seen, it could not be unseen. Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, but his posture had changed again. No longer defensive, no longer assertive, just present, absorbing, processing. The earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something more aware. Naomi took a slow breath. Her voice when she spoke again was softer than before, but it carried just as far. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. The difference is that this time it did not end quietly. The room held that sentence differently, because it expanded the moment beyond itself. It connected it to all the moments that had come before, the ones that had not been recorded, not been reviewed, not been challenged. Andrew glanced at her briefly, then back at his notes, as if confirming that what she said aligned with what the system was already beginning to reveal. Naomi continued, "I did not stay silent today, because I could not afford to." She paused, not for effect, but for truth. "I stayed because I knew the system would have to respond if I did." And that was the shift, the transformation of silence from something that once meant dismissal into something that now demanded accountability. A woman near the seating area nodded slowly, almost unconsciously, as if that idea had just settled into place for her. And in that moment the room was no longer just witnessing an event. It was understanding a pattern, one that had been invisible until it was named. And Naomi Carter stood there not just as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had chosen to let the moment unfold fully, so that what had always been there could finally be seen. The realization did not fade. It deepened, settling into the room like something permanent. And Naomi Carter understood that this was the moment where process turned into consequence. Not loud, not immediate, but structured and inevitable. Andrew Collins straightened slightly as his colleague handed him the updated tablet, the screen now filled with synchronized logs, internal flags, and recorded timestamps pulled directly from the bank's own system. "We have confirmed a sequence of actions. Beginning at 10:12 a.m., he said, his voice steady, each word placed with intention. Initial interaction, escalation without verification, public classification, and attempted removal." He paused briefly, not for effect, but to allow the sequence to exist as a complete record, all of which deviates from required protocol. And that phrasing mattered, because it did not accuse, it documented. And documentation carried weight that could not be argued away. Daniel Brooks listened without interrupting this time, his expression no longer defensive but tightened with awareness, as if each word was being measured against his own memory of what had just happened. Naomi remained still, her presence no longer the focal point of tension but the center of alignment, because everything now revolved around what had been revealed through her experience. Andrew continued, "We are initiating a formal compliance audit of this branch effective immediately." And that sentence marked the shift. From moment to system, from incident to investigation, a quiet ripple moved through the employees behind the counter. Not panic, not chaos, but recognition, because an audit was not a temporary correction. It was a deep examination, one that reached beyond today, beyond this room, into patterns, decisions, and records that had once gone unnoticed. Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward them, not to intimidate, not to single anyone out, but to acknowledge that this was no longer about one person. It was about structure, about accountability that extended beyond a single interaction. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower now, more controlled. "What does that involve?" he asked, and the question carried a different tone, no longer challenging, but seeking, because he understood that the answer would define what came next. Andrew responded without hesitation. "All client interactions within this branch over the past 12 months will be reviewed for procedural consistency," he said. Any discrepancies will be escalated to corporate oversight and external review if necessary. The words were calm, but their impact was expansive because they extended the moment backward in time, connecting it to everything that had come before. Naomi took a slow breath. Her voice when she spoke again was quiet, but it carried through the space with clarity. This is what accountability looks like, she said, not as a declaration, but as a reflection, not reaction, not apology, but review. And that distinction settled into the room with weight, because it reframed what justice meant in that space. Not immediate correction, but thorough examination. The young man near the teller line who had been holding his phone earlier lowered it completely now, no longer feeling the need to record. Because what was happening did not need amplification, it was already unfolding within the system itself. Andrew nodded slightly, acknowledging Naomi's statement before continuing. Additionally, all staff involved in the initial interaction will be placed under temporary administrative review pending findings, he said, again precise, again structured. And Daniel absorbed that quietly, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer assertive, just present, just listening. Naomi looked at him one more time, not with judgment, but with something closer to clarity. This did not begin when I walked in, she said softly. It began long before that. And that sentence expanded everything once more, because it reminded everyone in the room that what they had witnessed was not an isolated event, but the visible point of something that had been building beneath the surface, and now, for the first time, it was being brought fully into the light, not through noise, not through confrontation, but through a system that could no longer ignore what it had just revealed. The shift from investigation to consequence did not arrive with noise, it arrived with clarity, the kind that left no room for reversal. Andrew Collins looked up from the tablet once more, his posture unchanged, but the weight of what came next settled differently in the room. Based on the confirmed deviations and the preliminary findings, he said, his voice steady, controlled. We are moving forward with immediate corrective actions. And that phrase carried more finality than anything spoken before, because it signaled that the process had moved beyond observation, beyond documentation, into decision. Daniel Brooks felt it before the words were fully completed. The moment where uncertainty becomes outcome, his hands resting loosely at his sides now, no longer gesturing, no longer directing, just still. Andrew continued. Effective immediately, all authority regarding client interaction decisions at this branch is suspended pending full review. And the implication was clear, not removal yet, not final judgment, but the loss of control that had once defined his position. A quiet intake of breath moved through the employees behind the counter, subtle but present, because authority in that space had always been visible, and now it had been formally paused. Naomi Carter remained composed, her expression unchanged, but her presence anchored the moment, because this was not about reaction, it was about resolution. Andrew turned slightly, addressing Daniel directly now. You will remain available for formal inquiry, he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a requirement. And you will provide full access to all internal records as requested. Daniel nodded slowly. The movement small but significant, because it marked acceptance, not of guilt, but of process. Naomi stepped forward just enough to stand fully beside Andrew. Her voice when she spoke was calm, measured, but carried a quiet authority that did not need reinforcement. This is where it changes, she said, looking at Daniel, but not only at him, at the room, at the system itself. Not because of who I am, but because of what this revealed. And that distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus away from identity and toward action, away from status and toward behavior. A woman near the back straightened slightly, as if that sentence had settled something she had been trying to understand. Andrew nodded once, then continued. Additionally, corporate compliance will assign an interim oversight officer to this branch within the next 48 hours, he said. All operations will continue under supervised review until the audit is complete. The structure was complete now, the response fully formed, not rushed, not emotional, just precise. And that precision gave it weight. Naomi let a brief silence follow, not to emphasize, but because nothing more needed to be added immediately. The system had already spoken. Daniel exhaled slowly. his gaze lowering for just a moment before returning to meet Naomi's again. And in that look, there was something different, not resistance, not denial, but recognition of what had been missed, of what had been assumed, of what had now been exposed. Naomi held that gaze for a second longer, then spoke one final line in that moment, her voice quiet but unmistakably clear. "You did not lose control today," she said. "You showed how you used it." And that sentence did not rise. It settled, firm and final, leaving behind a silence that no one moved to break. Because now the outcome was no longer unfolding. It had arrived, not as an ending, but as a correction that would continue long after the room emptied. And Naomi Carter stood there, not as someone who had taken power, but as someone who had revealed exactly where it had always been. The room did not erupt. It did not collapse. It simply shifted into something quieter, something more aware, like a place that had just witnessed a truth it could not unsee. And Naomi Carter felt that shift settle into every corner of the space. In the way people no longer avoided eye contact. In the way employees behind the counter adjusted their posture not out of fear, but out of understanding. The moment had passed its peak, but its impact remained, steady and undeniable. Andrew Collins closed the final document on his tablet, the motion small but symbolic, signaling that the initial phase of action had been completed. "We will follow up with formal notices by end of day," he said, his tone consistent, professional. "All relevant parties will receive documentation outlining next steps." And there was no urgency in his voice, because urgency was no longer required. The system was already moving, already processing, already ensuring that what had happened would not disappear. Into routine. Naomi stood still for a second longer, her gaze moving across the room once more, not searching, not evaluating, just acknowledging, because this space had changed, not physically, but fundamentally. A young employee who had remained silent the entire time finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear. "I did not realize," she said softly. And she did not finish the sentence. But she did not need to, because what she did not realize had already been revealed. Naomi turned slightly toward her, her expression calm, not corrective, not critical, just present. "Now you do," she replied gently. And that exchange, brief as it was, carried something deeper than the entire confrontation. It carried understanding, the kind that does not come from instruction but from witnessing. Daniel Brooks remained where he was, but something about him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. His posture no longer carried the weight of authority, but something else, something quieter, reflective. He looked around the room, not to assert control, but to see it differently, to recognize the environment he had once managed without question, and now had to reconsider. Entirely, Naomi noticed it, not as a victory, but as a moment of change, because that was the purpose of everything that had just unfolded, not to remove one person, not to prove one point, but to expose something that could now be addressed. Andrew stepped slightly back, allowing Naomi the space to close the moment if she chose to. And she did, not with a declaration, not with a command, but with a statement that settled into the room with quiet finality. "This place will be better after this," she said, her voice even, steady, not because of what happened, but because of what will not happen again. And that sentence did not seek agreement. It established expectation, a standard moving forward, the kind that does not rely on visibility, but on awareness. The woman near the glass partition nodded slowly. The young man near the teller line slipped his phone into his pocket completely, no longer observing, just present. And the employees behind the counter began to move again, not back into routine, but into something more deliberate, more conscious. Daniel took a slow breath. His voice when he finally spoke again was quieter than before. "Understood," he said, and for the first time since the moment began, the word felt genuine, not defensive, not performative, just accepted. Naomi gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, then turned slightly toward the exit. Not rushing, not lingering, just moving with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning. And as she walked, the room did not return to what it had been, because it could not. Something had shifted permanently, something that would remain long after she left, not because she forced it, but because she revealed it, and that difference was what made it last. Naomi Carter did not rush toward the exit because leaving was not an escape. It was a transition, and every step she took carried the same measured control that had defined the entire moment. The sound of her heels against the polished floor was steady, unhurried, each step marking the distance between what had happened and what would remain. Behind her the room continued to move, but not the way it had before. Conversations resumed quietly. Transactions restarted, but everything felt more deliberate, more aware, as if every action now carried the memory of what had just unfolded. Andrew Collins and his team remained in position, already coordinating the next phase of review, their voices low, precise, the kind of communication that did not seek attention but ensured continuity. Naomi reached the glass doors and paused for just a fraction of a second, not because she needed to, but because she understood the weight of closure. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look back into the room one last time, not to check, not to confirm, but to acknowledge, and what she saw was not the same space she had entered earlier. It was something changed, something more conscious. The young employee who had spoken earlier stood straighter now, her posture no longer uncertain. The guard near the entrance no longer stood as a barrier, but as part of the environment. His stance relaxed, his presence no longer tied to enforcement. Daniel Brooks remained near the center, but he did not attempt to reclaim anything. He simply stood there, absorbing the shift that had redefined his role in that space. And for the first time since the moment began, he looked not at Naomi, but around him, as if seeing the room itself differently. Naomi gave a slight nod, not directed at anyone in particular, but at the space, at the system, at the moment that had unfolded exactly as it needed to. Then she turned back toward the doors and stepped outside, the sunlight meeting her with a quiet brightness, the air different, open, uncontained, and for a brief moment the noise of the city replaced the silence of the bank. But the silence did not disappear, it remained behind her, settled into the walls, into the structure, into the people who would carry it forward. Inside, Andrew's voice could still be heard faintly, continuing the process, ensuring that what had begun would not be interrupted. Naomi walked forward without looking back again, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, because she did not need to revisit the moment to understand its impact. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded recognition. She had not forced control. She had simply allowed the truth to surface and let the system respond to it. And that was what made it lasting, because it was not dependent on her presence. It was now embedded in the structure itself. A man passing by on the sidewalk glanced at her briefly, unaware of what had just occurred inside, unaware of the shift that had taken place just moments before, and Naomi continued walking, blending back into the rhythm of the city, but carrying with her the quiet certainty that something had been corrected, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. And inside the bank, long after she was gone, the space remained different, not because she had stayed, but because she had shown exactly why she never needed to. The city moved on the way it always did, cars passing, people crossing streets, conversations overlapping in fragments that never quite connected, and Naomi Carter walked through it without needing to match its pace, because what she carried was not urgency, it was resolution, the kind that settles quietly and stays long after the moment itself has passed. Inside the bank the process continued, not as a spectacle, not as a disruption, but as a recalibration. Andrew Collins and his team worked with precision, confirming entries, flagging discrepancies, setting the structure for what would come next, and for the employees still standing behind those counters. The shift was no longer something they were watching. It was something they were part of, every action now measured against a standard that had just been made visible. Daniel Brooks remained in place for a while longer, not because he had to, but because leaving immediately would have felt like avoiding what needed to be understood. He looked at the desk where Naomi had been seated, the same desk he had used to assert authority just minutes earlier, and now it looked different, not physically, but symbolically, like a point where something had been revealed that could not be undone. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition that what had happened was not a mistake in isolation, but a reflection of something deeper, something that now required more than a simple correction. It required change, real and sustained. A young employee approached the counter again, assisting a customer with a quieter tone, a more careful approach, and that detail, small as it was, marked the beginning of something new, not perfect, not complete, but different. Naomi continued walking until the bank was no longer visible behind her, but the moment did not fade. It transformed, becoming something she would carry not as a memory of conflict, but as proof of what happens when silence is no longer mistaken for absence. When patience is not confused with permission, she did not need to call anyone, did not need to confirm anything, because the system she had built was already moving, already ensuring that what had been exposed would be addressed. She paused briefly at the corner of the street, the light changing from red to green, and for a second she allowed herself to stand still again, not because she needed rest, but because she understood the weight of what had just been completed, not finished, but completed in its purpose. She looked ahead, not back. Her voice when she finally spoke was quiet, but carried the same clarity that had defined every moment before. I did not need to prove I belonged, she said softly, more to the moment than to anyone around her. I let the truth prove who did not understand it. And with that she stepped forward as the light changed, blending into the movement of the city once more, leaving behind a space that would not forget what it had seen, because it had not been forced to change. It had been shown exactly why it had to.